Harold, where were you? Why didn't you show up for my wedding rehearsal? Mom's been trying to call you since 6. She's really mad at you. Marcy's voice carried a mix of irritation and confusion. I paused what I was doing, turning to face her. And where exactly is your mother now? Marcy hesitated, her eyes darting to the side before answering. She just went to drop my biological dad at his motel. I caught that flicker of unease in her expression, but didn't press further. Instead, I returned to what her sudden arrival had interrupted, removing my certificate of commendation from the lounge wall. "What are you doing, Harold? Mom cleaned those frames less than 6 weeks ago," she exclaimed, her tone shifting to disbelief. Ignoring her protest, I carried the certificate into the kitchen, where I wrapped it carefully in bubble wrap. I packed it into a box that was nearly full, closing the lid with deliberate precision. Marcy, now visibly unsettled, followed me. The skirt of her dress swirled as she turned quickly, reminding me of the countless dance recitals I'd attended during her childhood. But this wasn't the same little girl who used to dance for her daddy. This was a young woman rushing back to the lounge to process what she was seeing. I trailed behind her, carrying the sealed box. Marcy's mouth opened and closed like a startled fish, her gaze darting across the room. Only now was it registering. Every item that had been uniquely mine, the plaques, the memorabilia, was missing from the walls and shelves. If she checked, she'd find my clothes gone from the wardrobe and my tools missing from the garage. I was at the front door, placing the box on the back seat of my car, when I sensed her behind me. Her voice, small and trembling with shock, broke the silence. "You're leaving us?" "Yes," I replied bluntly. "You finally noticed. I've been moving my stuff out for 4 days, and neither your mom nor you noticed. Doesn't that tell you something?" Her lips quivered as she spoke. "I'm sorry, Harold. I've just been so preoccupied with the wedding. But you'll come, won't you?" I shook my head. "No, I won't. I thought skipping the rehearsal tonight would have made that clear." "But why, Dad?" she asked, her voice cracking. I let out a bitter chuckle. "Oh, I'm Dad again now. Am I? Funny, considering I stopped being called that 3 weeks ago." Marcy shivered, hugging herself against the chill. Old instincts kicked in, and I found myself softening slightly. "Look, come back inside. It's cold out here," I offered. "I'll call Mom first," she said, her voice hesitant. "You can try, but her phone's probably off," I replied, walking past her and back into the lounge. I settled onto the couch, watching as Marcy left a hurried voicemail for her mother. Moments later, she sank into an overstuffed armchair, her small frame swallowed by its oversized cushions. She seemed lost, struggling to organize her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "Why aren't you coming to my wedding?" "Surely you have some idea," I said, my tone measured. She frowned. "No, I don't." Her confusion was genuine, but it carried a trace of amusement that stung. The self-centeredness often seen in brides had fully taken over, blinding her to anything beyond her big day. It saddened me to see her like this, so unaware, so wrapped up in herself. I pushed the emotion aside and focused on what needed to be said. "Marcy, I've loved you since the moment I met you. You were just a chubby 2-year-old back then, with fingers that were always sticky. I still love you, and depending on what happens next, I might continue to love you forever." I paused, choosing my words carefully. Finally, I decided to follow the format of the letter I'd written, now tucked in my pocket, waiting to be left behind. "When I met your mom, she'd just been dumped by your biological father. You know the story well enough. He was a drunk, and after she caught him with another woman for the 2nd time, she threatened to leave unless he promised to change. Instead, he left her. And you." I paused, giving her the chance to interject, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on me. "Your mom lost the house shortly after that because she couldn't pay the rent. Then we met, fell in love, got married, and moved into this house with my 2 sons, Tom and Owen. Our old place wasn't big enough for all of us. I loved your mom, and I loved you, just as much as I loved my own biological children. I never hesitated to take on the responsibility of raising you. I thought I did a good job, too, at least until a month ago." Marcy must have caught the tremor in my voice during that last sentence. It seemed to jolt her out of whatever mental space she had drifted into. "You were Dad. You were the best father a girl could ask for," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "My friends were always jealous of me. They couldn't believe it when I told them you were just my stepfather." She paused, her hand rising to her mouth as if to stifle the words, the realization hitting her like a slow-moving train. In those few moments, she understood what had taken me the past month to fully grasp. I stayed calm, continuing with the script I had rehearsed in my head. "I liked the guy you chose as your life partner, and I was the proudest man alive when you asked me to walk you down the aisle." I paused deliberately, watching as her expression shifted, the weight of my words sinking in. Her gaze dropped, her face turning away. "Yes, Marcy, you never actually uninvited me from walking you down the aisle, did you? But then your biological father came back, and suddenly, I'm out, and he's in, both in your conversations and your mother's thoughts. I'm yesterday's hero, aren't I?" I could see her wrestling with the whirlwind of emotions and realizations. Her mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came. "Did you know your mother has been so inattentive she didn't even notice I never rented the suit she asked me to for tomorrow?" The look of horror on Marcy's face told me the truth had landed. She had completely forgotten that she'd asked me, the only father she'd ever really known, to give her away on the biggest day of her life. I braced for an apology, expecting her to at least acknowledge what she had done. Instead, she surprised me. Her response wasn't remorseful. It was an attempt to justify everything. "Harold, you've met my bio dad. He's larger than life. You must see that. He only came back into my life last month when he found out I was getting married, and it's just been so wonderful. He has that flashy car and has been spoiling me rotten, buying me everything I so much as glance at. I mean, how could I not get caught up in it?" Her voice trailed off, and she added almost as an afterthought, "And, well, Mom too, I guess. We both just assumed he'd walk me down the aisle. I'm sorry, Harold. I completely forgot I'd already asked you." "Forgot, did you?" I replied, my tone sharp. "Or was it that he swept you off your feet?" "Yes, that's exactly what happened," she said earnestly, not even sensing how those words landed. "You've got to admit, he just oozes charisma. I was even telling Mom today." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was about to say and to whom. Her face, always as easy to read as a shallow pond ruffled by the slightest breeze, reflected the storm of emotions swirling within her. Guilt, confusion, denial, they all flitted across her expression. I watched her process it, waiting for the realization to fully sink in. I even saw the moment she understood how much her mother had been complicit in this disregard for me. For the past month, my own home had been dominated by their gushing about Mason. What Mason did, what Mason said, how Mason made everything better. I'd tried to show them how deeply it all hurt, but they were too blinded by his charm to notice. His broken promises hadn't seemed to bother them. The final straw had come just 4 days earlier when I overheard their conversation about the wedding seating arrangements. That's when I discovered I wasn't even included. My name wasn't mentioned, not as the one walking Marcy down the aisle, not as someone who deserved a seat in the front pew. Instead of turning up on the day and hoping for a place to sit, I had started packing. I tried to ease Marcy into the truth now, knowing the harder facts were still to come. "You do realize he's still the same lying, cheating philanderer he was 20 years ago, don't you? The same man who walked out on you and your mom when you needed him most. He hasn't changed. As soon as he gets what he wants this time, he'll abandon you again." "Don't be so bitter, Harold," she said, fumbling over the title. "I'm sorry I forgot to tell you that Bio Dad would be walking me down the aisle. That's my fault, not his. Don't take it out on him or start calling him nasty names. What proof do you even have that he's still the same man?" I rehearsed my reply silently one last time, dreading the reaction I knew my next question would provoke. I knew my 20-year marriage was over, but had I lost my daughter as well? No matter. As the old saying goes, in for a penny, in for a pound. "Where's your mom?" I asked, my voice calm but deliberate. Marcy's eyes flicked away from mine, darting nervously back and forth. The silence stretched, and I could almost hear her debating just how much I already knew. Did I intend to connect her mother's whereabouts with my earlier claim about her bio dad's unchanging ways? There was no doubt she had her suspicions. What remained was for me to deliver the final blow. "Let's end this 20-year association without a mountain of lies, shall we? Maybe we can salvage what little respect is left," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I found the condoms in your mom's purse this morning. still unopened, thankfully, which means she hasn't slept with him yet. But buying them 24 hours in advance leaves little doubt about her intentions, don't you think? Marcy's face betrayed her shock, but not surprise. I can tell from your reaction that you already knew, I continued. That makes you complicit in your mother betraying me and breaking our wedding vows for that slimy little jerk. Her mouth opened, no doubt to respond, but I raised a hand to stop her. Don't bother. Forget I even asked. The answer doesn't matter anymore. The fact that you knew and said nothing ends our relationship right here and now. I stood, stepped toward her, and pulled her to her feet. Hugging her tightly, I fought back the storm of emotions that had built up over the past month. I loved you, I said softly, letting those be my final words to her. I turned and walked out of her life, sparing one last glance from the door. The look on her face stayed with me. Utter devastation. Her pretty features streaked with tears, her breath coming in gasps as she fumbled frantically for her phone. I could guess her desperate hope, that her mother would answer this time, that maybe, just maybe, her mom hadn't physically crossed the line yet. Marcy clung to the idea that, somehow, I could still be convinced to forgive. She couldn't bear the thought of losing another father, the one whose cries for his wife to stop falling out of love with him had gone ignored for weeks while she fell back under the spell of a glib salesman with a sordid history. I shrugged. Whether my wife had crossed the physical line or not, the evidence I'd stumbled upon that morning was damning enough. I'd initially planned to move out temporarily, hoping to convey the depth of my anger over the last month. But that discovery changed everything. In the hours that followed, I accepted the hard truth. This was permanent. Driving away from the house we'd shared for 20 years, I knew my conscience was clear. The rest of this story is part fact, part hearsay. But both are needed to understand what happened. Earlier that day, I had tried to find the motel where her bio dad, the jerk, was staying. My goal? To witness my wife's betrayal firsthand, to harden my resolve for what I knew needed to be done. Unfortunately, my search was fruitless. Instead, I moved to Plan B. After leaving Marcy, I parked a little down the street from our home, turning off my headlights and waiting. Less than a minute later, she sped past me in her car, her urgency so obvious that even a herd of elephants could have trailed her unnoticed. I followed her to a motel and parked just far enough away to avoid detection. She dashed inside, heading straight for a particular room. With my trusty old SLR camera and its zoom lens in hand, I wasn't far behind. When Marcy's raised voice drew the door open, it was her mother who appeared, clad in a hastily thrown-on motel dressing gown. Her hair was tousled, her face pale. Behind her, in nothing but boxers, stood her ex-husband. Strangely, it wasn't the sight of them together that shook me. What struck me was the look of sheer panic that crossed Audrey's face as she opened her mouth to speak. I had spent 20 years shielding Audrey from emotions like panic and despair. It becomes a habit, second nature even. But those days were over. I threw my camera onto the passenger seat, switched off my phone, and drove into the night. Once Marcy stepped into the motel room and the door closed behind her, my direct knowledge of what happened next ended. Everything else came to me later, pieced together from various sources. The wedding did happen the following day, but not at 10 in the morning as planned. It was delayed until 6 in the evening. The chaos started with the bride's mother, who had spent the entire night searching for me before collapsing in exhaustion. Once she was found, more time was wasted looking for the bride's biological father, Mason. As I had warned Marcy, once Mason got what he wanted, he disappeared. I often wondered what motivated him. My research revealed that he and his second wife never had children. Perhaps he saw walking his daughter down the aisle as another life experience to collect. Or maybe it was Audrey, still an attractive woman, that drew him back. Was it a nostalgic trip down memory lane, or just an ego trip for a self-centered man? He had turned on the charm and pursued her until she gave in, just as I'd warned her he would. But when the situation got too hot and he'd achieved his goals, Mason vanished. It may well have been the most expensive dalliance of his life. Before he even made it home, compromising photos were already in his wife's email inbox. She wasted no time dumping him and enforcing their ironclad prenup with brutal efficiency. Word spread that she took over her father's company, cutting Mason out entirely. Rumor also had it that Mason was found in an alley a week later, badly beaten and permanently damaged. His father-in-law, known for fiercely protecting his daughter, had reportedly never approved of Mason. Whatever the truth, by the time the bridal party finally got moving, Mason was long gone. The church ceremony missed its original window, but the vicar kindly rescheduled for 6 in the evening. I never learned when Audrey discovered her carefully chosen dress had been ruined. The stitching had been meticulously undone, leaving it to fall apart in her hands, just as our marriage had unraveled at her hands. Ignoring all attempts at contact from Audrey and Marcy, I focused on moving forward, my voicemail filled with their pleas for me to come back. But that bridge was already ashes. As expected, Audrey left a long, tearful message claiming she'd only gone into Mason's motel room to talk after dropping him off. She insisted the condoms in her purse were part of a gag gift for the wedding reception. But 2 photos attached to an email exposed those lies. The first showed her standing in the motel doorway, her dressing gown hastily tied, her left breast exposed. The second zoomed in, leaving no doubt about her betrayal. My response was simple: sorry. I followed up with a request that, for the sake of preserving whatever good memories we once shared, she not contact me again. To her credit, she respected that request for the most part, sending only the occasional well-wish through family. Gossip tells me she struggles to move on and hasn't dated since. The divorce was straightforward. I made a minimal offer, and she accepted it without a fight. Audrey accepted the divorce terms with good grace. As for me, I stayed at my younger son's house for a while, keeping my car hidden in his garage. Both of my sons refused to take their stepmother's calls, fully aware of how much I'd been hurt. Marcy's new husband managed to track me down eventually. I liked him, so I agreed to talk. He explained that Marcy had tried to dissuade her mother from her ill-conceived plan, but Mason's influence was too strong. Despite everything, her husband and I still catch up occasionally. From what I hear, the relationship between Marcy and Audrey remains strained. Whether it's because Marcy blames her mother for losing both her fathers, or because her husband prefers to keep Audrey at arm's length, I'll never know. I expect I'll mostly forgive Marcy one day. My sons already have, and her husband regularly urges me to do the same. If the pain weren't so fresh, I might have been devastated to hear about Marcy walking alone down the church aisle. Her mother sat in the front row, haggard, her makeup streaked with tears. The groom couldn't even recall if there were 1 or 2 empty seats beside her. Not that it mattered to me anymore. My interest was purely academic. Between the original wedding time and the delayed ceremony, the groom had pressed Marcy hard about her actions and her thoughts regarding her mother's betrayal. He ultimately decided that a bride who'd had the harsh consequences of infidelity thrown in her face might serve him well in the long run. He poured all his energy into rallying the guests back for the rescheduled event. However, word of the scandal spread quickly. Audrey barely lasted 30 minutes at the reception. The accusing stares from both sides of the family cut her to the core, forcing her to leave early. Even now, I sometimes wonder whether Audrey regrets losing me more than ruining her daughter's wedding. I spent the following months grieving, allowing myself to process everything. I feared I'd never trust another woman again. And then I met Hazel. Ironically, Hazel was the widowed mother of Owen's fiancé. We met 12 months after my split when she came by to help pre-plan her daughter's wedding. From the moment we spoke, the connection was undeniable. Any lingering fears about trust quickly fell away. I had always dismissed the idea of soulmates as sentimental nonsense, until I met mine. By then, my feelings for Audrey had been reduced to ashes. The process of moving on was complete. Carpe mulierem, I thought. Seize the woman. Within 4 weeks, I moved into Hazel's home. I knew without a doubt that she was the woman I'd grow old with. Her children welcomed me into their family with open arms. Today, her daughter has asked me to walk her down the aisle. Even that can't erase the constant grin on my face, one that makes my cheeks ache most days.